Esty.
Good morning.
So today we're going to be speaking about distance in relationships. One of the most painful things for couples or for any relationships is when somebody feels misunderstood and a certain distance because that person is not with them at that moment. And, as much as we go through a lot of things in life, one of the most painful daily things could be feeling like someone doesn't get you.
Yeah.
And so, we wanted to focus a little bit on what are some of the things that make relationships better and help improve relationships.
Yeah.
I find it so fascinating how, what's the most important thing that people want to talk about all the time? What's on their minds, at least in therapy or in life, is relationships, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it feels like it's just a buzzkill of we're always talking about this and why are relationships always on our mind?
Right. It's so repetitive and boring to a point. Every share, every book, every podcast, you know?
It's people, relationships. And it's
Exactly.
enough, right?
But at the end of the day, it's what's going on in our life. And that's why there's so much attention to it. But it's also a sense of again, talk about that again.
It can feel kind of repetitive. But then at the same time, it's the most important things in our lives. And it's something that really makes our life happy when they're good, right? Think about living on an isolated island. Life would be kind of boring and lonely, right? Most of the things that we do on a daily basis are only exciting because of who we're with. And that's why relationships is the biggest topic in our life, because our lives are determined by the people around us.
Yeah.
And so when that doesn't work, or when they're more challenging or difficult, or when there's some drama connected to it or pain connected to it, it's going to be the ultimate thing that we want to fix in order to get our lives back on track.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most famous people one of the most famous researchers who studied relationships and couples in specific is Gottman. And it was John and Julie Gottman, the two of them. They've done that for 4 decades, a really, really long time, where they just observed what makes a happy marriage.
Yeah.
And that's really everyone's trying to figure out the secret sauce of what it is to be in a good marriage. And obviously there's no secret sauce, but there are certain things that help improve it.
Yeah. I think that by them observing so many marriages that lasted versus marriage that didn't last, they were able to break it down into what do people who make marriages last do different than people whose marriages don't last.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously not including any mental health issues or abuse, but in a healthier marriage, what are the differences?
Yeah. And it's almost they came up with 7. I don't think we're going to talk about all those 7 today, but there were 7 keys to a successful relationship. Yeah. And there's some that stood out in my mind of what comes out so often. And, the first one is the emotional bid. Where couples actually, instead of just listening to one another, they go and they ask more questions about it, and they turn towards each other. And with that, what an emotional bid looks like is that, let's say someone comes home from work and they're talking about their day. The spouse comes in and says, whoa, what happened? Tell me more. Right? They ask follow-up questions about it, because it's not just oh, okay, you had that day, and then just silence, let's just change the channel and, watch a different movie or something, or what's for supper. It's more about tell me details, tell me more. It's showing interest and turning towards them rather than turning away from them.
Right, exactly. I feel the example that comes up to my mind is of you're taking a nice walk and say, oh my gosh, look at that boat. And the spouse can either just grunt, and move forward, or oh wow, yeah, I love how the water is shining off the boat. What do you like about it? And that is creating connection. Yeah. And that's the opposite of what we started this podcast off talking about, disconnection and distance and how hard that is. If somebody's walking and says hey, look at that boat, and the other partner doesn't respond to that, that leads to isolation. Right. That's I'm noticing this by myself in my own world. Nobody sees me. Nobody sees what I value. But that small emotional bit of being oh, wow, what do you like about that boat? Or, oh, I love that the water is glistening. Yeah. That leads to a stronger bond of connection.
And the thing with these emotional bids is that it's happening every single second of when you're together, right? It's not just all these big moments. It's almost when someone comes home and has a conversation, or when, let's say a wife comes home and she heard an idea that day and she's what I heard from my friend, what do you think about this? Right. And the spouse is just who cares, or doesn't really lean towards it. Those are all the small moments that then build towards connection. But enough of those can really fracture a relationship and create a certain amount of distance.
Right. And listen, it's hard. We all get it when we're like mentally exhausted at the end of the day, whether it's taking care of kids, whether it's working, whether it's other personal things, that sometimes it's hard to like engage in conversation.
Yeah.
You know, but it's, you know, I think that when people say like marriage is hard work, it's like always like, what do they mean marriage is hard work?
What do they mean?
This is one of the things that it means. Like when you're tired and you had a long day and you really want to disconnect because that's what you need, sometimes spending a few minutes turning towards and working on the connection then is connection that's gonna what's the word? It's connection that's gonna pay off in the end because it's connection that you need. So even though in that moment it's hard to get that connection, it's like paying towards a better future.
Right. It's all those small moments that eventually flourish into a beautiful relationship.
Exactly. And you know, I think the scariest thing, at least for like me or whatever, I think that one of the scary things like I have when I'm like either watching a movie and I'm reading a novel, and you so many times they have like this older couple that's just like disgruntled and unhappy and they're debating getting divorced or life changes and all that stuff. I'm always like, how do they get here? You know? And I think that this is a way how they may have not gotten to the happy ending.
Yeah.
By not turning towards, by not giving each other the emotional bids, they can end up 40 years later being like, how did we get here with no connection? Because if you're not going to put in the money towards connection, if that's mental, emotional, physical energy, then suddenly you're going to look one day and turn back and be like, how did we get here?
Yeah. A relationship is not something that's, you know, occurs on its own.
Exactly.
It's reminding me of the story. And I think it was Erev Pesach when I was first married. And I was taking a walk with my husband, just like in the streets. And you can tell, like, it's like that Pesach air where like you smell like the smoke from like,
and like cleaning products.
There was literally, and it's a high stressful time, right? You know, Erev Yontif. And we passed by this house, and this husband and wife, they must have been in like their 70s or maybe 60s. And they were fighting with each other. And we looked at each other and we're like, whoa, like they're fighting in public. Like even though it's in their house, like it was in front of their house, and they were yelling and screaming at each other. And we're like, what happened? Like at that point, like you're supposed to be past all this. Like you don't have the energy anymore to fight. Like you should be on good terms already. And she was so angry. And then he was so angry, right? And it's almost like we're looking at this and we're this young couple, obviously, like petrified of like, oh my goodness, like tell us the secret to like how to not get there, because like that just looks so scary.
It's so funny that scares you. What scares me is seeing people who have like nothing in common anymore, nothing to talk about anymore.
Just like
that's what scares me. Like
disconnecting away from each other.
Yeah. That's what scares me. The fighting, it's like, okay. So they had a bad day. You know what I mean? At least they have the energy to still fight, the passion to still fight.
Interesting, because like the fighting doesn't scare you as much as like just the like disconnect.
The disconnection.
Right. Yeah. Like having nothing anymore. Like, and I think that does happen with some couples, right? Where they just like they grow apart. They grow. Yeah.
And how do you grow apart? It doesn't just happen. So when people look back and like, we grew apart, like, no.
Right.
You grow apart when you don't put the effort and the work to stay together to make that connection.
Yeah, which makes me think of Gottman's next thing, because he talks about solvable and unsolvable problems. And every couple will have some problems that then they can find solutions to. But there's going to be perpetual problems that are ongoing problems that there's nothing to do about. They're always there. And it's making me think about that, because what if a couple is different? That's a perpetual problem, whether it's different in the religion, right? One is more religious, one is less religious. Or one perpetual problem can be that their personalities are off. Or what if like their humor is different, or their ways of having fun is different? Or what if like they have different opinions about raising kids, or different opinions about finances, right? Those might be just perpetual problems that the couples need to figure out how to work with, so that way it doesn't create distance between them.
Because also, talking about one of the scary things, when I think that one of the famous things that everyone says is like, the thing that you disagree with on the date is the same thing that you're going to be fighting with when you're 80. I don't want to fight about the same problems. Like, I hate repetition.
Right.
And I think that that's the point. Like, perpetual problems, it doesn't mean like you're throwing up your hands and saying that's it, but it's like working around it or accepting it and not fighting or let it cause like all this tension about things that can't change, but focusing your energy on solvable problems.
Right. You know, perpetual problems are probably going to take up 10% of the marriage, whereas 90% are going to be solvable. Majority of things have answers, but there's going to be those things that, and those, you know how they say like 90% of people take up 10% of your time, 10% of people take up 90% of your time. Yeah. I think like in marriages, like most people harbor over the non-solvable problems, like the ones that are just constantly coming up at it, because it's almost like fighting against that, fighting to change it. I need to change this about you. Like you need to do this for me, and it's obviously coming from a place of need, right? So like majority of the perpetual problems, like they can't be solved, but we're constantly fighting against them.
We're using up all our energy, and then you have less energy for the solvable problems. And then you kind of like give up and say, you know what, you're not going to change, and you're not going to come with me to shul. Well, then I'm not going to talk to you about how I don't like how you talk to my mother.
Right.
because they're all not going to change and you
Right.
kind of give up your hands. Well, being able to differentiate between the difference between probable and solvable is very important. Being able to say like, okay, what can I accept? What is not going to change? And what
Yeah.
can I live with?
Right. Because what happens is that if we don't accept the non-solvable problems and the perpetual problems, we then turn into a gridlock. And in that gridlock, like there's just like contempt for one another. There's just defensiveness, and those
You're
things make you
You're not
stuck,
moving.
right? And it's not building love. You're not building meaningful encounters together because you're almost like, if this doesn't get fixed, our marriage cannot work.
Right.
And I think a lot of people have that belief in relationships where if this doesn't have if this isn't in place, I can't survive in this relationship. And obviously some of those things, okay, maybe they are non-negotiables. Majority of those perpetual problems we can live to work around. Right? You can live to work around if you're not having the same style of fun as your spouse. You can work around that, right? Have fun with your friends. If your spouse is not as deep as you can find ways of working around that, right? Have depth with others, have depth at work, have depth with your children, right? Find ways to work around it. If your spouse is not as organized as you are, you be the more organized one or work around it in a sense. That's going to be a perpetual problem. They're not going to wake up one day and say, oh, I'm so deep. Or they're not going to wake up one day saying, I'm so organized.
Right.
But what you can do is say, I have this need for organization. What am I going to do to make sure I'm okay? And that's where it's taking the responsibility of saying my life is not dependent on somebody else's limitations. It's dependent upon myself.
And it's so hard. I was saying it's so hard for me. It's so hard for the world, the society. I feel like this is the biggest thing. I'm only going to be good when they change.
Yeah. Right? And they don't change.
We don't change.
No, it's not. And we can't expect change.
Right.
They teach us all this, when we're in school, don't expect them to change. I think there is some change, but it's not necessarily the change that we want. The perpetual problems are not necessarily gonna adapt that much.
I love the next one that Gottman talks about is about letting your and I feel like it connects to the solvable problems, which is letting your partner influence you. I mean, maybe that's just my love language. If you can be influenced by something that I do, to me that's really I love that. But I think I like it more because it's about that. It's about the solvable problems because it's kind of like holding both, right? We can hold two things. They're not going to change, but also we can be influenced by other people. And I think that you learn so much in school and relationship books and marriage books and the surrendered wife, right?
Yeah.
You're never going to change the other person. You're never going to change the other person. You're never going to change the other person. But then Gottman says one of the pillars to a long-lasting, loving relationship is letting the other partner influence you.
Yeah.
That means there can be change. It's just finding what can be changed and what cannot be changed.
Right.
And I think that allowing the other partner to influence you, I think to me, coming from the mentality of where I feel like I learned so much, you're never going to change the other person. You're never going to change the other person, accept how they are, how they are. It opens up a whole room for freedom. No, I'm not talking about everything. And I'm not talking about perpetual and unsolvable problems. But there is a space in a relationship to be able to grow and learn from the other person and be influenced because of that.
And I think the key piece of that is that we can't control it, right? If you're allowing yourself to change, that means you're allowing yourself to change. It's not like you're telling your partner, you have to be influenced by me. Allow yourself to be influenced by them. With that, and then also don't expect them to change, right? Holding both of those, because it's really the ball's in your court then. If you're doing all this towards your spouse, it's not going to be good for your own expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why is it so hard for us to change? Why is it so hard? When we say let your partner influence you, why, I'm thinking for myself of why would someone be resistant to their partner changing them? And I think what that comes down to is we're scared to lose ourselves. If we're so open to their way of doing things, we're scared that we're going to lose everything that we've built up for us, or that we don't want to become so enmeshed in the other. We want to have our own
identity,
selfhood,
our own values.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason that people get so resistant and so stuck. And then sometimes you're not even seeing clearly of oh, there is another way to be, because you're so stuck on this is me, accept who I am. I'm not going to change. This is how I've been doing it my whole life, blah, blah, blah. But if you take away that message in your head and you move it away, I feel like it gives a whole room for freedom to evolve and to change. And in order to continue with life, we're always constantly evolving and changing. You're not the 4-year-old that you were. You're not the 16-year-old you are. You weren't the 30-year-old that you are, But if we kind of stay stuck in that message, then we can't evolve. We can't change. We can't grow as a person. But people are really scared of the idea of someone else influencing them.
Right.
It's the idea of losing your own autonomy.
Yeah. It's like I remember like when we started the business at first, right? So there was two ways to roll sushi. Either you can roll it away from you or you can roll it towards you. And I used to roll it towards me and my husband would roll it away from him. And he looked at me and he's like, "You're doing that so oddly." And I was like, "Doing what so oddly? Like, this is just the way that's more comfortable for me to do it." So he's like, "That doesn't make any sense. Like, it's for sure quicker my way." And after a while, I said, like, "No, I can't really adapt to the way that you're doing it." And he said, "Okay, you could do it your way and I could do it my way." And then like we both like did it our own ways. But I think like in that moment, it was like, for me, I was so threatened of like, I'm not going to do it your way. Like, I need to be me and you need to be you. And it's something as simple as like, how to roll the roll. And, I think like when we hear all these examples when we're younger about like, he's going to throw his socks on the floor and, you're going to put the toilet paper in the wrong way, the right way. And like, you're going to want to set the table one way and he's going to want to set it another way. And it's like all these like little things. And you're like, okay, you roll your eyes. And I think like, it's not about the examples. It's more about losing yourself in the examples of like, if I know myself to be a certain way, now I'm going to change it to be another way. Like that just feels too threatening. But I think like we have to realize that number one, you can still do things your own way. And number two is that if you choose to do it the other person's way, it's not the end of the world.
Right. I think that's more than it's not the end of the world. I think it's like there's a sense of freedom. And when you realize that like you don't have to hold on to certain things so strongly, I think it gives a sense of relief. To realize like, oh, wow, I can open my mind to the world. Mm-hmm. I can be changed by my environment. I can be changed by people. And I'm not talking about just the relationship with your spouse. This can be from a coworker, mm-hmm. a different way of thinking about how to do the work, from a friend, from your child's school teacher at school telling you something that might help with parenting. Like we get so scared to lose ourselves, to lose our, because we spent our whole life building it up, right?
Yeah.
As a child, your parents telling you what to do. Like it took so long to be at a place of like, I know who I am. I know what I want. And now at the same time that you literally just got a handle on it, it's like, well, if you want to make a relationship work, time to be flexible. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I think that makes people so scared because it's like, wait, I was fighting against my school system. I was fighting against my parents. I was working so hard to like make conscious decisions of who I am. Now you're telling me to let that go. And it's like, no, you can do both at the same time. You can still hold mm-hmm. on to who you are and be who you are. But if you realize that there can be other ways, it can be so freeing when you take on something and your influence and it bettered your life.
Yeah. I think that's the struggle of what they mean when they say like marriage is hard. It's balancing your independence with your connection at the same time, right? It's like having a unit identity, but then having an individual identity and trying to be in both worlds at once.
And that is a hard balance to have both of them. Yeah. But if we stay stuck in only one, you're losing out on the other, right? If you give in fully, and you get enmeshed in a relationship, you lose yourself, which then people 40 years later look back and say, who am I outside of my marriage? Right. Who am I outside of my children? And that can lead to a lot of like confusion, But at the same time, if you stay stuck just in yourself, then you're losing out on the connection of what a relationship can give to you.
Right. And I think it's so fascinating how like the people around us, not just spouses, our friends influence us. Right. Everybody around us influences us if we're open to it.
If we're open to it.
But automatically, like when you're with couples, like a lot of times, like if you knew them before and you knew them after they're married, you start seeing how they've merged towards each other and they start sounding like each other and they start saying each other's things. And it's almost like automatically, like by osmosis, you start taking on things about them that you might not even realize.
On the other hand, I think it's to me personally, I think it's like a really nice thing when someone's like, oh wow, like look how much if it's for the good, look how much they changed in that relationship. Like mm-hmm. I would never expect her to be this way, and look how she is now.
Right.
And I feel like it gives a lot of points towards that relationship of like how strong is their connection. And obviously, we're not talking about getting enmeshed at an unhealthy level. We're talking about to a level where you can still hold yourself, but you've allowed yourself to be connected enough to be influenced in certain ways.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something so beautiful that can come out of that. We hate difference because we want someone to just be like us and think like us because it's so much. We think it's so much easier to connect. But here what we're saying is like when you are different, you then grow.
Exactly, right? If we were the same, we wouldn't be challenging to each other, right? Nobody would get on each other's nerves.
Right.
Nobody would push your buttons.
Right.
Right? I mean, everybody always says like opposites attract. And yes, you do find couples that are like two sides of the same coin. And I'm sure that's really beautiful. But I'm saying there's the part that like when you marry differences, it pushes you to grow. And I think that's so powerful. And it's so, again, back to like what is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to have your buttons pushed all the time. And if we resist it and we fight and we're like, don't do that. You know that I don't like that. I don't accept that. Then again, you're closing off connection to grow.
Right. I think also like that really ties into the perpetual problems, because one of the perpetual problems that a couple might find themselves going through is that the other is different, right? It's a problem that they're different.
Yeah, that's not changing.
And so instead of like going and saying like, we have to change this, of saying, no, this perpetual problem is actually beneficial to us. Like this is something that's going to help us. And that's one way of maybe surviving the perpetual issue, of working around it. But, I one of the perpetual problem is something I think that comes up so much in conflicts with spouses of, you have to be this way in order for me to be okay. And, I want to just like highlight that strongly, even though it might be repetitious and it might be, I would like scream it everywhere. If this was, one of the things that people can just take away is recognizing there's always going to be a perpetual problem that you cannot solve. And you might think that you're going to go to couples therapy, and you might think that you're going to go to a Rav, or you're going to go to a mediator, or you're going to go to your in-laws and try to convince them to change your spouse. But at the end of the day, that problem cannot be solved. And the only thing that people can help you with is learning to work around and accept it. And nobody wants to hear that, right? If we would write articles, about like relationships, what it all boils down to is work around things, accept things, learn to come to terms with your needs. So that way you're not so hurt by the other thing that your spouse doesn't have. And it sounds like a very simple situation, but it's not, right? It's something that takes a really, really long time. But that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. Oh, I think this was really interesting. Like a little like tidbit on like a few factors that lead to like pillars, according to John Gottman, of a good marriage. And I would love, like, we only touched on a few of them, 3 of them, I think.
Yeah.
And there's so much more. So like, let's continue this conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Alrighty.